Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Institute for Spirituality and Health, welcome to our Houston IANS August program, conversation with Dutch cardiologist and near-death experience researcher Dr. Pim van Lommel on the continuity of our consciousness. My name is Cyrus Worrells, and I serve as Director of Programs for the Institute for Spirituality and Health in the Texas Medical Center. And one of the classic questions we get when we tell people about the Institute for Spirituality and Health is, what do you mean by spirituality? So our mission is to enhance well-being by exploring the relationship between spirituality and health. But what do we mean by spirituality? I think it's important to consider the definition in relation to today's program. Our president, Reverend Dr. John Graham, defines spirituality as our innate ability to connect with one another, to connect with our environment, to connect with the transcendent mystery that many of us call God or Allah or Krishna, or choose not to name, and to connect with our deepest, truest self. And I think for those who know about near-death experiences, and to all of those who will learn more about them today, the NDE certainly directly involves all of those levels of connection. Another way that we consider spirituality is through the big questions of life that all of us have answers to on some level. And so at ISH, we consider humans to be fundamentally spiritual beings. And deep down, we all have answers to the questions, whether we consciously engage them or not, of why am I here? Who am I? Where am I going? How am I to live? Where did I come from? And many others along that route. And those sorts of questions that Dr. Van Lommel, you mentioned in the beginning of consciousness beyond life, and that, of course, are raised by the near-death experience if you've had one, and just hearing about near-death experiences brings up these questions. And so I hope to invoke and invite all of you to kind of bring up those questions today, to allow them to open up, to be considered anew, and to kind of honor this space of spiritual consideration that this represents and that these experiences invite from us. So now for the moment we've all been waiting for, I want to welcome our guest speaker, who we're so delighted to have, Dr. Pim van Lommel. As you probably know by now, is a Dutch cardiologist, and actually was practicing cardiology in the Netherlands when it was a relatively new specialty. And as he'll get to here shortly, encountered a near-death experience, and then later learned more about near-death experiences, and through that was prompted to initiate, conduct, and publish in the Lancet in 2001 a groundbreaking prospective study of near-death experiences among cardiac arrest patients, 344 cardiac arrest patients, that really was the first of its kind in near-death research, and broke ground and paved the way for a lot more research that has happened since then. And he's authored over 20 articles on near-death experience, as well as published his book, originally called Endless Consciousness in the Netherlands and published in English as Consciousness Beyond Life, the science of the near-death experience, which is quite a powerful read. I recommend it to everyone here. So we're so happy to have you, Dr. Van Lommel, and thank you very much for being with us.
I'm happy to be here.
So, as we've advertised, we're going to talk today about near-death experiences and their implications for consciousness and the possible continuity of consciousness. But I want to go back to before you knew what a near-death experience was, and really before the term had even been coined, to ask you how you got into medicine. What attracted you to medicine?
I was doubting between the study of physics and the study of medicine, and at last it became medicine, and then I specialized in cardiology, which is a lot of physics as well. So I loved the challenge. Another aspect was that cardiology was such a new specialty as well. During my medical study in the 60s, cardiology was just about valve disease and congenital heart disease, and not at all about coronary heart disease, which only started in 67 to 69 with the coronary angiography and bypass surgery. So and then later came the pacemakers, the echocardiography, the ICDs, the stents, the PTCA, etc. So during my career, I was involved in all the new aspects of cardiology as well. But of course, I've never heard about anything about near-death experiences at all. But in '69, just during my rotating internship, I was working in the third coronary care unit in the Netherlands, because it started because of the new resuscitation techniques, which is the electrical defibrillation and external chest compression. So when it was available, then we started worldwide coronary care units. So before 1967, all patients with a cardiac arrest died, always. We had a patient 44 years old with a myocardial infarction, and he had a cardiac arrest, and we resuscitated him. The CPR took about 4 minutes and several defibrillations. And when he regained consciousness, we were so happy as a resuscitation team. I was the doctor in charge. But the patient was extremely disappointed and told me about going through a tunnel, seeing music, seeing the light, beautiful landscapes, etc. And so we were happy, and he was just disappointed that he was back again. I never did anything with it, but I never got it as well. Until in 1986, read a book by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow, where he describes that he died in 1943 as a medical student by double pneumonia. And there were not antibiotics available for this medical student, so he died. His body was covered with a sheet, and the nurse was so upset that this medical student died that he was able to persuade the medical doctor to give him an injection with adrenaline right into his heart, which was quite uncommon in that time. And after being declared dead for 9 minutes, he regained consciousness and had a very deep near-death experience. And I wrote a book about it. Well, this man, and also his book, was also for Raymond Moody to start to study near-death experiences. And he published the book Life After Death, Life After Life in 1975, but I've never heard about it, never read it as well. But when I read the book by George Ritchie in '86, I was so curious that I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And within 2 years, out of 50 patients who had survived a cardiac arrest, 12 shared the NDE with me. And that was the moment that my scientific curiosity started to grow, because I had always learned in university and medical school that it was impossible to experience consciousness with memories, with cognition, with emotions, etc., when your heart stops, when your brain stops functioning. So I had learned that it was impossible. Now I have met 12 patients who shared their NDE with me, very emotional, very reluctant to share it with me as well. So that was the reason to start a study, prospective study in the Netherlands in 10 Dutch hospitals, to if we could know anything more about the cause and content of an NDE, because until that time there had been just retrospective studies with a lot of selection of patients, and people thought it was just anoxia of the brain, lack of oxygen of the brain, or hallucinations, or neurotransmitters, or dreams, or whatever. That never had been done a prospective study as well.
Before you dive into the design of the prospective study, for anyone who doesn't know about a near-death experience, can you overview some of the
What it is. Yeah.
common features? Yeah, what is a near-death experience?
So I call it near-death experience the reported memory of a period of a special state of consciousness with universal elements. That is like the idea to being dead or being out of the body, and you can see from above your own resuscitation of your own brain, your own surgery. You can come in a dark space. You can go through a tunnel to an otherworldly dimension. You can meet deceased relatives. You can meet a being of light. It's a feeling of unconditional love and acceptance and compassion. And mostly with this being of light, you see your life review. You relive your own life from birth, being connected with the consciousness of others as well in the past. You can see sometimes future events. You can come to a border. You can hear the message that it's not your time yet. You have still to fulfill something in your life. And then you come conscious back into your body, which is an awful experience because you feel again the pain of your traffic accident or from your heart attack as well. So this, not everybody has all these elements, and they usually are mentioned when people have a life-threatening event like cardiac arrest or severe blood loss in complicated childbirth, or traffic accident with coma, or near drowning with children. But you can also have the same kind of experiences in the meditation, in isolation, in severe depression, or end-of-life experiences. So you don't have to die, nearly die, to have this kind of experience. So it's also why these experiences are called transformative spiritual experiences. And one of the main aspects is that it's always transformative, that people change. Ideas about death. Death is not the end. It's not the end of who you are. There's a continuity of consciousness. They have a new insight of what is important in life. It's all about love, compassion, accept first towards yourself, to accept your own negative aspects. We have it always. And then the feeling of being connected to others, to nature, to the planet Earth. So that's also why near-death experience are called the experience of oneness. And the third aspect is enhanced intuitive sensitivity. And people are usually very reluctant to share this aspect of transformation with others as well.
And these experiences, as you reference in your book, are not new. They kind of show up across cultures and religious traditions and in writings across time. I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Well, Plato has described the classical near-death experience by a soldier Earl, but he also described that death is not the end, and that there's a continuity where he says the soul is eternal, but the body is just a temporary barrier of the soul. And the body will die, but the soul will never die. And also in the Upanishads, the Vedas of Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism, or agnostic Christianity as well, of the Kabbalah, but also indigenous people from all over the world have known that death is not the end of who we are.
So when you heard the first experience in '69, and then you read the book, and then you encountered these 12 patients over the course of those 2 years. What was your thought about what consciousness is at that time, and how did you react to these profound experiences you were hearing?
Well, I was sure that consciousness should be a product of brain function. So that is why it should be impossible as well that people could have enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. So it didn't fit what we had learned on medical community. And still, medical schools and universities, it is always said that consciousness is a product of brain function. Still, most neuroscientists, philosophers, and psychologists believe that consciousness is a product of brain function. But when you think about near-death experience in cardiac arrest, then we know that in cardiac arrest, the brain function stops within seconds. So you lose consciousness within seconds. The blood flow to the brain, you can measure by Doppler. The carotid artery is blood flow is 0 within 1 second. So your body reflexes are gone, which is a function of the cortex of the brain. And your brainstem reflexes are gone, which is the gag reflex, the corneal reflex, or widened pupils who don't react to light. And the people stop breathing because the breathing center is close to the brainstem. And there have been studies done with the registration of the electrical activity of the brain, the EEG. And then you see in those studies that the EEG flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds. So we know now, I didn't know it in '86, we know now that the brain function stops. Cortex, the brainstem don't function at all. And then people can have this period of enhanced consciousness with cognition, with memory, with emotions. And that should be impossible. So the reason why we started the study is how can we explain the cause and content of the NDE?
Well, that's a perfect segue. So tell us about the study.
Well, first of all, we started also in '88 when we started to study the Dutch ions. So that is already 33 years ago. Also for the same as you did in Houston, to the people with an NDE can meet each other. Also family members can meet each other. They can learn more about NDE and about the after effects. And the third aspect is to study the NDE, which we did. So we studied a total from, from '88 to '92, 44 consecutive patients who survived a cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals. And we found that only 18% of those patients reported an NDE and 82% did not have any memory at all. So the challenge was, how can we explain the difference between the 18% of patients with an NDE with memories and the 82% who didn't know anything about the NDE? And what we found to our surprise, that the duration of cardiac arrest, so 2 minutes or 8 minutes, didn't matter at all. The duration of unconsciousness, so 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, didn't matter at all. A very short NDE, cardiac arrest in electrophysiological studies, where usually people are resuscitated within 20 to 30 seconds, didn't matter at all. Complicated CPR with the necessity to give artificial respiration didn't matter at all. So the severity of lack of oxygen in the brain did not explain at all why people, only 80% of the people have an NDE, because 2 groups were the same. And it was also with the medication. So there was no difference in medication between the 2 groups, with and without an NDE. No difference in psychological aspects, so fear of death didn't matter at all. Foreknowledge that the people know that these experiences can happen didn't matter at all. Gender didn't matter at all. Education, and also religion, if the people are Christian or Muslim or atheist, didn't matter at all. So the main conclusion of our prospective study was that there is no real scientific explanation why people can have a near-death experience in cardiac arrest, because all patients have been in cardiac arrest, all patients have anoxia of the brain. And most people had a lot of medication as well, but there was still a difference in the outcome. And the second part of the study was a longitudinal study. So we interviewed all patients who had a near-death experience with a taped interview, 2 years and 8 years, sorry, following the cardiac arrest, with a matched control group of patients who had also survived the cardiac arrest but didn't have any memory at all, with the same gender, the same interval, same age. And we found that there was a statistical significant difference between the two groups. Only patients with a near-death experience had a classical transformation, which is the loss of the fear of death. New insight was reported in life and enhancing to the sensitivity. So this objective aspect of transformation was the proof of the subjective experience, because we still cannot prove in our current material science what we feel and what we think. Subjective experiences are beyond our current material science. So that was the challenge.
So I want to get back to that and bring up a lot of skeptical arguments. But while you were talking about the after effects, I want to spend a little more time on the comparison you make between the people who, the after effects experienced by the people who had a cardiac arrest but not an NDE, with those who had an NDE. Because the cardiac arrest survivors who didn't have an NDE experienced some long-term effects too.
Yes, but they changed a bit, but not about the three transformative aspects we know from NDEs. So people without an NDE still had the fear of death. They still had not a real new insight of what is important in life about acceptance and so. The search for spirituality was much, much more people with an NDE than without an NDE. And enhanced interpretive sensitivity was not available in those patients without an NDE. So there was still people with a cardiac arrest change a bit, but not the classical transformation we know from people with an NDE.
So you brought up that during the state of cardiac arrest, when all blood flow has ceased to the brain, oxygen is no longer supplying the cells, the neurons, and the EEG has been shown to be flat in that state. The skeptical arguments that come to mind that I know you address in your book, but I'll pretend I haven't read it for the sake of the interview. How do we know that the experience happened while the EEG was flat, as opposed to as the brain was going down, or created as the brain is coming out?
Yeah, that's an important question as well. So we know that before people lose consciousness, it's going so extremely fast that they don't remember anything from it. And when they regain consciousness, usually they're very disoriented. They don't know what happened, where they are. They don't realize that they had a cardiac arrest as well. And because of the theoretical aspects of out-of-body experiences, that people can tell exactly what happens from a position out and above the body, about the resuscitation, about the CPR, what was said, what was done. And we know that it is always after the first 10 to 20 seconds after the onset of cardiac arrest. And like what we also described in the Lancet article, what is called the case of the dentures. Shall I explain it to you? Well, the case of Denture was a man of 44 years old who was brought into a hospital, the coronary care unit. He was found in a meadow about 30 minutes before. The people had just started some insufficient CPR. And when he was brought into a hospital, they had tried in vain some defibrillations. And the first thing the nurse wanted to do was to intubate the patient, to give him more oxygen. And they found out that the patient had dentures in his mouth. So we took out the dentures and put it somewhere underneath on the crash cart. They intubated the patient, and it took about 1.5 hours before the patient had sufficient blood pressure and heartbeat again. But it was still in coma, it was still artificially respirated. So it was transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the artificial respiration for 1 week. Then he regained consciousness and was brought back to the cardiac ward. And he was just there when a nurse came in for medication. He saw the nurse and he said, "You know where my dentures are. You took it out of my mouth and I put it somewhere on a sliding underneath and a car with a lot of bottles on it." And the patient could describe exactly the small room where he was resuscitated. He could describe the nurses and the doctors who were busy with his CPR. And he was the resuscitation room. He came there in coma. He had left in coma. He still could describe from a position out and above his body. So what this means is that this man had cardiac arrest for 20 minutes. He was without any sign of life. He was already cold. He had blue spots on his body and no breathing, widened pupils, no heartbeat, whatever. And he had his out-of-body experience. So this is what we call the corroboration of critical aspects. So you have to ask doctors and nurses what really happens when you heard the story of a patient who had an out-of-body experience. And then you can see that they saw exactly what happened. And they know not even what was said, but even what was thought by doctors and nurses. They know what they think as well. Of course, they don't hear it, but it is going through thought transfers. And they can have a 360-degree sight, so they can look around and see the detail as well as the overview as well. And there has been a chapter written by Jen Holden in the book, Handbook of Near-Death Experience, but also a recent book, The Self Does Not Die, with more than 100 cases with corroboration of critical perceptions during out-of-body experience, what means that consciousness is still there when the body doesn't function at all while there is cardiac arrest. And you can have perception and emotions and cognition during the moment that the brain and body don't function at all.
So the case of the dentures guy is so compelling. How do skeptics explain away that and other remarkable cases? I mean, what do they say about it?
They cannot explain it away. They just said, well, there must be some function of the brain left, otherwise he couldn't have seen it. But they don't realize that in those patients, the eyes are usually shut and the perception is out and above the body. So they dismiss a lot and just say it's impossible. So there's not really a discussion possible with debunkers. They don't know the literature, they don't know the book like The Self Does Not Die. And they just state that because they have learned that consciousness is a part of the brain function, when people have consciousness, it must be a function of the brain. So they dismiss these kind of cases as well.
Yeah, it also is something you address in your book, and that I've heard from skeptical friends, is that it's sort of it's like a dream or a hallucination, or just a blissful release of endorphins when the brain's dying. So can you just say a word about that dismissal?
Well, of course, it's not a dream, because people who have an NDE, they know exactly the difference between a dream. They usually forget them. And this is an experience in your consciousness which you will never forget. When you talk to patients 50 years after the NDE, they know it into detail. They never forget. And there have been studies done about the memories of people with an NDE. And the memories from an NDE are much more stronger, whatever life event ever happened in their life. Hallucination is not about what really happens. And another thing is that for a hallucination of delusion or illusion, you need a functioning brain. And the brain doesn't function at all in cardiac arrest. So by definition, it cannot be a hallucination as well. And endorphins is just a short shot, and an NDE that happens for minutes or longer. And it has a lifelong transformation, and endorphins will never give a lifelong transformation as well, and not the same aspects as an NDE as well. But I write extensively in my book, I dismiss all this kind of materialistic approaches and explanations of NDE, and they all are, in my opinion, are wrong.
So then, what do you conducted the study, and you found that none of these medical, psychological, or pharmacological factors could explain the NDE. So then, what is your conclusion?
Yeah, well, the conclusion is that death is not the end of our consciousness. So when the brain stops functioning, people can have an enhanced consciousness, a much more deeper consciousness than we normally have in our waking consciousness. You have more memories than ever. And you feel connected with other people. You can have a review of your life, with reliving your life and being connected with the consciousness of others in the past as well. You can have your future events. So your consciousness is in a realm where there is no time and no space. And people can talk for days to weeks about the life review when the cardiac arrest takes only some minutes as well. So everything happens at the same moment. So a totally different kind of consciousness, beyond time, beyond space, and it happens when the brain doesn't function. I always tell there's no proof, scientific proof, that consciousness is beyond, still is there after cardiac arrest. But it is beyond reasonable doubt, because when the brain stops functioning, people can have enhanced consciousness, and that has been proven by all the studies with cardiac arrest patients. So what has been proven is a non-local consciousness, which is not dependent of the brain. And what has been proven that the aspects of this consciousness is in interconnectedness with everything and everybody, and they still have the same feeling of consciousness when they are back in the body. That's what I call the enhanced intuitive sensitivity. They still feel connected with others. They still feel connected with nature. And they're so that I always said, normally we receive channel 1, our own consciousness, where they receive channel 2, 3, and 4 of other people, and they know exactly what they feel, what happens in their life. They know also someone will die in 3 weeks, and they will die. So they have what I call the non-local information exchange. We receive information not by the senses and not by the body, and information is beyond time and beyond space, which is totally terrifying for them as well, because they're not used to it as well. Perhaps one other aspect I have to mention, that when you had this near-death experience, and we heard it so many times as well, you're happy and you are impressed by this experience, and you start to share it with your doctor or nurses, they dismiss it. So they stop talking about it. And even partners, family members, friends, don't listen or cannot listen. The divorce rate is more than 70%, because the partner said it's not the same person as before their experience. And so it is a period of loneliness, depression, and homesickness, but can take years and years before they find someone where they can share their experience with. Then they can start to accept it. Where you can accept your experience, you can integrate it, and you can change the way you live. We had once had a study in 82 patients in Holland with a near-death experience, with a time interval between 7 months and 70 years, with a mean interval of 24 years. With a mean interval of 24 years, still half of those patients were not able to share their NDE with others. So they have been silent for years and years. So that's a huge problem as well.
So I definitely want to spend some more time on particularly how healthcare providers can be more aware and make more space. But kind of leading to that, what factors do you think precipitate someone having a near-death experience? What are the range of causes, and what determines whether or not someone is going to have an experience?
Well, the answer can be simple. We don't know. But we know some other things as well, because there's been one study done in very young children, this prospective study. There they found that 70% of those children had a life-threatening event like coma, near drowning, or meningitis or encephalitis. but 70% had an NDE. In retrospective studies with the mean age between 30 and 40 years old, usually traffic accidents, drowning accidents, etc., the percentage is about 30 to 40%. In our study, we found 80% of the patients with a mean age of 62 years old. But we found also that patients under the age of 60 had more NDEs than the older group. So age plays a role. The younger you are, the more chance you have to have a near-death experience. But it's not a scientific explanation, it's just a finding. And we also know that people who had an NDE as a child, also in our study, had more often an NDE in cardiac arrest as an adult. We also got women had sexual abuse as a child. They usually leave the body. They had more NDEs as an adult. So I always say the connection between the consciousness and the body as a child is more loose. And the older you are, the connection between your consciousness and the body is more fixed. So you will take perhaps more time to get out of your body. I'm sure that everybody who dies will have the death experience. In our study with cardiac arrest patients, you're resuscitated within 5 to 10 minutes. So a lot of people at that age will need more time, and perhaps 30 minutes or an hour before they have the death experience, that they have brought back or died. So, but it's just a speculation. But I think that everybody will have a death experience. And the younger you are, the more chance you have to have a near-death experience, because as a child, you're not fixed with your consciousness to your body as you are when you're older.
To that point, that everyone will have a death experience, you've said that you've distinguished it from dreams and hallucinations sharply, but then you've also said that in your book that people can have fear-death experiences or near-death-like or identical experiences through processes of meditation or even just taking a walk in the woods. So what kind of makes those experiences comparable? What are the common elements of those experiences?
The common elements are the content of the NDE. Also end-of-life experiences, meditation, severe depression, existential crisis, isolation, shipwrecks. Astronauts had it as well, Mitchell and Glenn. Lindbergh had it when he flew over the ocean. So that means, that's why we call it the spiritual experience, a spiritual transformative experience, or STE. And what we know from studies with neuroimaging techniques, like in the use of LSD or dimethyltryptamine, ayahuasca, or psilocybin, we know that when people have this enhanced conscious experience, but only a small percentage of those people who use these drugs have it, then you see parts of the brain are less active, not more active, they're less active, and they have a more enhanced consciousness as well. So it seems that, like we have an NDE, in cardiac arrest, there is no function at all, but when some parts of the brain are less functioning, you have more chance to have an enhanced consciousness as well. So the brain for me is an interface or a filter or a transceiver, transmits and receives information from consciousness. And our waking consciousness is just a small part of this non-local enhanced consciousness. And when you had an NDE, what I thought a threshold, what William James called the threshold of consciousness, has changed. So you receive much more information from others and from nature as well. So the receiving capacity has permanently changed. And it is also an aspect that proves that the brain is a transceiver or interface and not a producer of consciousness.
So would you explain the fear-death experience and the experience of isolation in the same kind of way, that there's some lowering of a threshold?
Well, the fear-death experience is when you're driving your car and a truck comes from the other side straight to you, and you think this is the end. Or mountaineering accidents you have as well. You're falling down, you think, well, this is the end. You can have a kind of near-death experience as well. And so they're not the explanation that there is anoxia of the brain. Like what I said in the near-death experience, there's no scientific explanation why people with a cardiac arrest have this NDE and only 80% have this experience. So forget the materialist explanations we hear and read about.
So if the scientific medical community were to really open up to the near-death experience, the reality of the near-death experience, and the possibility of non-local consciousness, how does that impact aspects of medicine and how we take care of patients and make healthcare choices?
Well, I think as soon as you, as a physician, realize that death is not the end, you change the way what we think about death and about life as well. So when people are dying, and you know that's not the end of your consciousness, then you're not fighting at all. So we, as physicians, can learn a lot of people with an NDE. I always say that people with near-death experience have been my greatest teachers as well. You can learn a lot from them, and we have to change the ideas about how we treat patients in coma, how we treat terminal patients when they are dying, palliative care as well. But also, let's say organ transplant. What would we think? Is brain death really death? Or is it just a process of dying as well? And then taking living organs from a patient who are already officially declared death, but they have living organs. And a corpse cannot give living organs, and you cannot give artificial respiration to a corpse as well. So there are a lot of aspects we can discuss in the medical community. So, and I think as long as doctors are aware of this kind of experience, you should ask patients when they have had a coma after a traffic accident or near drowning or cardiac arrest, and you should be open and interested and refer to books or programs. And I always, when patients come to me and say, well, my doctor didn't believe me at all, I always say, well, give my book to them, and they do it. And the doctor can change it because the book explains there is much more than we have learned in university and medical school.
What tends to be the linchpin that opens the mind of a skeptical physician or medical student? And I guess that relates to why and how were you open originally as a materialist physician to the NDEs? How has your mind changed?
Well, for me, it took some time because I've always, like I told you before, I had learned that consciousness is a product of brain function, which was impossible when you study near-death experience. So it took me a while. And now I'm convinced that consciousness is fundamental in the universe. Consciousness and information is fundamental in the universe, and everything comes from consciousness as well. So consciousness is primary in the universe. And but it took quite a long time before I could accept this. About physicians, medical doctor, I know that as soon as they have an NDE themselves, like Evan Alexander or Miriam McNeil's and many other medical, then they change. Then they have the new insight that death is not the end of who we are. And medical students are much more open. Let's say I've lectured quite a lot for medical students and other younger people. And the younger generation is much more open for this kind of experience than my generation, the older generation. And Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, once has said that as soon as the older generation has died, a new concept will be accepted. And it took already 60, 80 years before quantum physics was widely accepted as well. So it takes some time to accept the new insight that consciousness is primary. Another aspect which we did not mention at all is not only near-death experiences, you have also shared death experience at the deathbed and the life experiences, but also after-death communication. We know from studies in Europe that about 125 million people in Europe have had contact with the consciousness of deceased relatives in the first days weeks or months after the death of a close relative. And when you have contact with the consciousness of the deceased relative, there's sometimes feeling, seeing, smelling, communication with it, then you know for sure that consciousness is still there when you have died. So the combination of near-death experiences, shared death experiences, after-death communication, I think brings together that consciousness has no beginning and has no end, and it is beyond time and beyond space. And death is just the end of our physical aspects and not the end of our consciousness.
So it seems there are kind of levels to this, the process that you went through of believing in non-local consciousness and the possibilities there. And it's a philosophical and a practical question as to, you know, at what level do you introduce someone to it? Because there's convincing doctors based on the data that show that people who have had an NDE and get rejected do, you know, worse psychologically because of that dismissal. And that's kind of a clinical finding. You know, you can say, look, this is how to better take care of your patients. It's an entirely different level to say, you know, your fundamental picture of reality needs to be turned on its head, and ultimately consciousness is primary and based in principles from quantum physics, and, you know, and it radically transforms the way you think of not just how you practice healthcare, but who you are and what it means to die. And so what's the kind of trajectory? I mean, do you go full force from the beginning and just catch whoever you catch, or is there kind of a pace?
Both aspects are very important. That means, as a physician or a nurse is much better than doctors in general, but you have to be open and listen without any comment and prejudice. That's the first thing. You can help people. Doctors are not so good in it as well. They're always in a hurry. Another aspect is how to convince scientists about the new aspects and how what we think about consciousness and non-local consciousness. And that's the scientific approach, is that what we can, in the current material science, only it is true that we can objectify, what we can prove, what we can duplicate, what we can falsify. But consciousness, what we think and what we feel, the content of our consciousness, we cannot objectify, we cannot prove, we cannot duplicate it, we cannot falsify. This, the consciousness that we experience, our subjective reality, is beyond our current scope of materialist science. So we have to change science, we have to enhance, expand science into what we call the post-materialist science. So we have more than materialist science, because we have to include subjective experience as well. So that's a change in science for the last 10, 15 years as well. And that's important. So the consciousness studies help us to change the idea of science as well. And I think that's important for scientists, for doctors, etc. as well. So there are two aspects: a psychological approach for people and a scientific approach or to help scientists and doctors to change their mind.
How can subjective experiences be effectively and rigorously incorporated into a scientific process?
Well, they have to trust and accept the subjective experiences you have and someone has. So the first person experience is important as well, not only the third person experience. So, and you know as well, as we everybody know, what we feel and what we think, nobody knows. Nobody can prove it. Nobody can objectify it. So it's what I told you, it's beyond our current materialist science. Maybe talk about subjective experience. So we have to include and accept subjective experiences as well. And that's important for the near-death experience as well, because this is a subjective experience. The second aspect, what I told you about transformation, is the objective aspect of this subjective experience as well. So the transformation is you can measure. With the subjective experience, you cannot measure nor prove.
Hmm. So if you had all the resources in the world, academic, institutional, financial, and you didn't necessarily have to be the one to conduct the full study, but if you were to see a study conducted, do you have any kind of visions of what that would be at this point?
But my opinion is that we know now so much more about consciousness and the mind-brain relationship and the primacy of consciousness as well. The problem is that most scientists and neuroscientists don't know anything about it. So for me, a major tool was to have the possibility to make the scientists more aware of what we know now. And for medical education, for hospitals, for nurse education, etc. We have to change what we know, what we have learned. We have to get rid of our dogmas, because what I call science is asking questions with an open mind and forget what you've learned. And then you're open, and then you can listen without any prejudice and comment as well. So I think the most important thing, and the general population is much more open. I think in the US, about 75% have some idea about continuity of consciousness or life after death, whatever you would call it. I call it continuity of consciousness because life is a biological principle, and there's no biological principle when your body has died. But there's still, most people have the idea that the death is not the end. But scientists, it's only less than 10% believe this idea.
Hmm. So I have, I could ask you questions till the dawn of time, but I've already, many questions are pouring in the chat. I do want to invite people, if you have a question, you're welcome to ask it yourself. But if you go to the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a place where you can raise hand, virtually raise your hand. And that'll be the order that I call on you to unmute and ask your question. So go ahead and virtually raise your hand if you have a question. But I'm gonna start with some of the questions that have already poured in the chat and run through those first. So good question from Pat. Do NDEs report having seen a religious figure like Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, etc., during their experience or not? And I'll just add to that question, kind of commenting on how culture plays a factor in the content. Culture or religious background plays a factor.
Well, it's important because the near-death experience is an ineffable experience, so there are no words for it. So how you have the interpretation and how you put it into words is depending on your age, your culture, your religion. Children will use different words as an adult. The Christian will have used different words from a Muslim or from an atheist. So we know that people can, when they have a Christian background, they usually say, I've seen Jesus, or a religion, or an angel. Children will talk about angels. There was one study in Eastern Germany when it was still a communist country, and they just told about seeing light and not about a figure as well. And Hindu people can sometimes see Krishna or Brahma. So it's depending on your background, how you will interpret this religious person as well.
Another question was, you've touched on what scientists and doctors need to be aware of. How, when a doctor is made aware, this is from Pat Johnson, how does a doctor, when made aware of the NDE, take care of a patient? If they've heard, if the patient says something about an NDE, what does the doctor do or say?
The doctor should listen without any prejudice and without any comment. And that's a problem for a lot of doctors because they are always in a hurry. Nurses are better, what I told you before. And when they're not able to listen, then you can refer But you first have to know that you had a near-death experience yourself. So when it just happened, you were so overwhelmed by this experience. It's such a truth for you that when people don't believe you, you just keep silent for years. And you don't trust anybody anymore to share it with others as well. So the doctor should be open. They should know something about NDEs, or you should refer, as soon as you know something about NDEs, you should refer the doctor and help them to see programs or read a book or whatever to help them for the next patient with an NDE, that he is much better prepared for it. But it's the same for family members and partners as well. So it's still, what I told you, is a huge problem. I know Elizabeth Crowe took it many, many years before they could share it with others. And that's what you usually hear.
And how does a doctor or other healthcare provider best ask? You know,
I just had always one question. And the question is, do you have memories from a period of unconsciousness? That's it, an open question. And then they said no. But they said, why? And then it can start. So you have always need to have an open question. Do you have memories from a period of unconsciousness? That's it.
So another great question is, going the other direction, a healthcare provider or family member accompanying a patient who's in their transition from life to death. How has this NDE research informed what you would suggest to someone in that position?
I don't understand the question.
Well, I'll just read it directly. Can you comment on the experience of a healthcare provider or family member who accompanies the patient in the transition from life to death?
Well, I think the physician is just involved in the CPR or in surgery. It's not involved in patients having a transition at all, because they're not learned about to think about it. Just learned about to resuscitate patients, and that's it. Only when they are aware of the transition and they're aware that death is not the end, then they can be aware of what could be possible in the consciousness of people have the transition. But usually they're not aware of anything.
This is a very different subject from Paula, but the question is, does quantum physics help scientists be open to subjectivity?
Well, quantum physics is just an analogy to understand consciousness, which I mean is that in quantum physics we have learned that everything is beyond time and beyond space, and everything is interconnected. And so it's not an explanation for near-death experience, but it is an analogy to understand the aspects of consciousness we hear from patients. And a very interesting aspect of quantum physics is that we have learned from very famous quantum physicists, Nobel Prize winners, that they know that a scientist, the consciousness of a scientist defines the result of the tests you're doing. So we can prove that light is behaving as particles, and we can prove that light behaves as waves, and both is possible, but it's impossible to have both aspects as well. So the consciousness of the scientist is not just objective, but it is a subjective aspect of the experiment as well. So that's important to know, that there is no, in quantum physics, but not all quantum physics believe this. But for me, science is just subjective, because the reality we can experience as well is subjective reality. There is no objective reality at all, and also not in science.
And you reference in Consciousness Beyond Life at least like 6 to 10 quantum physicists, as well as neuropsychologists and others, but in particular quantum physicists who believe that consciousness is primary because of their physics research.
Exactly. Yeah. So there were, because of what they did, they intuitively knew that consciousness has an important role in quantum physics and in science as well. We did it as well, and we had several resuscitation rooms where we had a hidden sign, and Penny Sartori, a British study, did it as well, and the Aware study from Sampania also has hidden signs as well. Now, there has never been this objective proof. The objective proof is the corroboration of theoretical perceptions, that people can tell what happens, which was impossible to know, or where can people have seen and heard things in the other part of the hospital, which is impossible to know. But the explanation, what we can perceive also in daily life, is dependent of our intention and attention. When you drive your car and use your mobile phone, there are many more traffic accidents because you don't see the other car coming. When I ask people about where they have driven, where they have seen a castle or wood, they didn't see it because they were driving their car. So you don't perceive anything, what's happening around you. And when you have an out-of-body experience, and you see, to your big surprise, your own resuscitation, you see people working on your body, you don't start to look around if there is some hidden sign as well. And that's what we call the unintentional blindness. So you need intention and attention. There have been tests done, and I describe it in my book as well. There have been tests done about unintentional blindness. So you need attention and intention to perceive, also when you're driving as well on the road. And that's for me the explanation that there is no so-called objective proof by hidden signs, but the objective proofs are the corroboration of theoretical perceptions.
It's also sort of a limited number of opportunities even that the studies are able to produce, right? Where it's in the same room and you get the NDE or who has the OBE.
Exactly. So people are resuscitated in the street, in the ambulance, in the elevator, in the ER. You have many rooms, some coronary care units, intensive care units. You can have a cardiac arrest in the ward. So it is impossible to put everywhere hidden signs. That's another aspect as well. I know from some studies done, I think also in New York, about psilocybin given to terminal patients. And they lose the fear of death as well. But also have communication about the death experiences can help as well. I know from a patient, I heard from a general practitioner who had a patient who was dying at home and was frightened to die. And the doctor came there twice a day. And when he came there, the patient was laughing and happy. And he said, "What happened to you?" He said, well, Jan came by and he reassured me. And Jan was the neighbor who died 2 years before. So this communication with a dead relative makes him convinced that death is not the end. So also near-death experiences can help people to change their ideas about death is not the end. And of course, the dying process can be painful. But as soon as you know it's not the end of who we are, they change their ideas as well. They're more at ease as well. So in palliative care, I know that people are talking about near-death experience, and also people who have a near-death experience. A lot of people are working in palliative care and hospices just to help patients to transition for their transition, because they know exactly what will happen to them. But what you describe is what we call a shared death experience. So the consciousness is leaving the body to transition, and then it can happen that the room can be full of light, full of love. People are happy, and we know it much more from palliative care and terminal care. People are dying the dying process, that the room changes, the light changes. Sometimes people see the essence of who they are, the conscious. The moment of death, they see a light bulb leaving the head, top of the head, etc. So this is what I call the shared death experience. And because leaving the body consciously is not a second, but it is a process. The dying process is indeed a process. So it can take minutes or more before really the consciousness has left the body. And sometimes they say, oh, wonderful, and die, or oh, beautiful, and they die. So because they are already in the other dimension, and end-of-life experiences can happen before the moment of death. And they also have sometimes are out of the body and see deceased relatives or light or beautiful landscape, and they know that people are coming to get them, to take them away. So there are a lot of aspects of the dying process, and this which is different from the near-death experience, but it is all about the dying process. Most people at NDEs say, but I'm realizing now I'm living in an illusion, that it was real, more real than what was up there in this non-local consciousness, which is beyond time and beyond space. So time doesn't exist. Everything happens at the same moment. You can be at the end of the universe at the same moment. You'll be back in your body as well. So there's no distance and no time as well. The moment you leave your body, that's just a fraction of a second. But before you can leave your body, that will take more time when you have in the process of dying. But when you have a near-death experience, it can be very effective. What I told you before, we have a cardiac arrest of 2 minutes, people can talk for days about it, but because everything is there. So time doesn't fit at all in the other direction. We live in an illusion, and the reality, the home is up there, love is up there, but you still be in touch with the other dimension as well. Yes, you have the enhanced intuitive sensitivity, I believe. You can feel other people, you know some things that other people don't. So your threshold of consciousness is other. But about the age, I think that children, young people, are much more open because they are not still strict connected to the body, much more easy out of the body. And the older you are, the more you're fixed to your body. So the process of leaving your body takes more time. But the moment you leave it is instantaneous. At the age of 4 or 5, you can have spontaneous stories of previous lives, and after that it's impossible because they're more fixed in their body as well.
And that's actually a good segue to another question I saw in the chat, which was, does the subject of reincarnation come up in these experiences or discussions? Dr. Van Lommel, can you comment on the implications?
Well, it hardly ever happens that people can have an experience of a previous life in the NDE. But like Ian Stevens has done very important studies about reincarnation, and Jim Tucker is doing it now. He studied thousands of cases with spontaneous stories of previous lives, and especially the book about biological changes. There have been about 40 cases that people, young children, can tell how they died. And usually spontaneous reincarnation cases are of an abrupt death by murder, by violence, etc. And about 40 cases of children have scars of the way they died in previous lives. So they have in the skull here and here dot, and they were shot, or they were strangulated, and you see some scars up here. So congenital changes in the body of the child is the same as they tell you about the way they died in the previous lives. So even proves that consciousness plays a role in how your body functions and how your scars are formed. by previous life events as well. So spontaneous reincarnation stories are usually by death, by murder or violence. Also soldiers.
So I'll put it to you. Do you feel like reincarnation is likely, or do you believe in reincarnation?
Well, it's not black and white. I think it's highly probable that there is reincarnation because there is no beginning, nor is there an end to consciousness. And I think that we come back in our body to learn other aspects of what I call the higher self. And all religions had the idea of reincarnation, Hindus, Buddhists, Kabbalah, indigenous people as well, anthroposophy, but Rudolf Steiner has the same ideas as well, and I write a little bit about it in my book as well. So you have the religions and all cultures as well as the modern science by Ian Stevenson. So it's highly probable.
I remember you mentioning in the book that, and this relates back to near-death experiences, of how much of yourself gets reincarnated, and by the same token, in a near-death experience or as you die, how much of your self-identity is maintained across that border.
Yeah, well, I think our aspect of the ego, this aspect of awakened consciousness, which is body linked, is lost, but the essence of who you are is still there. That's why we can recognize people during NDE when they have deceased relatives. You know who they are, and you recognize them, and you know the character as well, and also the after-death communication. It's still about people, you know who they are. So the essence of who you are is still there. But the ego aspects are lost. It's not about jealousy, not about greed, not about other things, but just about love and connection. When you have an existential crisis of severe depression that you don't know how to live anymore, that you think it's not used for me to live, then you can have this crisis. Then you can have a moment of enhanced consciousness, usually in light experience, not all the aspects of a near-death experience, but usually it's a spiritual transformative experience with light, with love. It's a total different insight as well. And you will change the rest of your life. And there are a lot of people, what we call now a mystic, have had this kind of severe depression or existential crisis and then changed totally after the experience as well. Rudolf Steiner had it, but a lot of mystics had it as well.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was asking. I wondered if the experience often includes a sort of bliss or transcendental clarity.
Yes, it's total bliss, total acceptance, pure love, etc. There are terminal patients, and I know one study where they have one patient with this activity. I know that there have never been registered in the acute cardiac arrest, but you're talking about patients who are in the dying process. And when you have an acute cardiac arrest, the EEG flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds and never have been monitored one gamma activity at all. And I've also show this EEG registration cardiac arrest as well in a PowerPoint. So I think there's a difference between the cardiac arrest and the patients who are dying, in the process of dying on the ICU or on terminal care. There's a difference in it. So that the clinical findings in cardiac arrest are the total loss of brain function. So the cortex doesn't function, the body reflexes are gone, the brain stem reflexes are gone, the blood flow to the brain is zero, the breathing is gone. But we still don't know exactly if it is hibernation or that it is really the death of cells, but it doesn't make any difference at all, because when there is hibernation, when they're not functioning at all, but not still death, then still they're not functioning. And we know that for consciousness, we need the global activation of all the neural centers, combination with the exchange of information and communication between the neural centers. And this global network is not available in cardiac arrest as well. So I'm still convinced that we cannot explain NDEs by brain function. Don't kill it, but there's a functional loss. The functional loss is immediate. You can see it in clinical finds. So there's loss of consciousness, no body reflexes, no brain stem reflexes, which means a functional loss. No breathing, functional loss. But they're not dead. That's something else. I think it's totally normal to stick on your own dogma. Because that is what we've learned, what we're studying, what we're doing research about. Also, materialist neuroscientists are still looking for consciousness somewhere in the brain. So consciousness studies help to change. But like quantum physics, it took 30 years, or to 60 years. And Thomas Kuhn has written that when you have new findings in research, in studying research findings, there are two options. Ridicule and say it's impossible, or to change your paradigm. And to change a paradigm takes time, what I said as well. So it will take time to change ideas about consciousness. And the first thing I said before, that the problem is, the challenge is that we cannot prove and measure and objectify consciousness. We cannot prove and objectify what we think and feel. So it is beyond our current materialist science. So we have to change, to expand science and accept subjective experience. And then we can come more closely to the concept of non-local consciousness and to the primacy of consciousness as well. But I'm sure it will take some time as well.
Well, thank you for your contributions to that process. You said in our preliminary conversation it wasn't courageous, but I insist that your research is courageous within the medical community, and it's done such a great deal for near-death experiencers, for existential thinkers, and for everyone, as we all come to better understand ourselves and what life is about together. So thank you very much for your work and for taking the time and even a little bit of extra time with us today, Dr. Van Lommel.
You're welcome. You're welcome.